Open your Bibles to Acts chapter 27. We return to our study of the book of Acts. We are in the second to last chapter, and this chapter is all about a voyage from beginning to end. It really reads like a travel log. There are so many details here, and you wonder, why did Luke include all these details about this event that it's significant, but there were many other significant events that went on in the Apostle Paul's life and all the other people in the early church. Why this? Listen to what A.T. Robertson writes about regarding Luke's details. He says, the great detail and minute accuracy of Luke's account of this voyage and shipwreck throw more light upon ancient seafaring than everything else put together. In other words, we learn about life on the seas 2,000 years ago from Acts 27 more than anything else we can read out there in any library that you could find. Luke just gives detail after detail after detail. If you don't like sailing, try to like it because you'll understand this better, you'll enjoy it more. But we're going to use maps, we're going to talk about navigation, we're going to talk about the voyage, of course. I thought, let's just move through this chapter quickly at one point. I thought, let's just get the voyage over with. But there's too much here. There are a lot of details that won't connect to us because we don't know much about Cyprus and Crete and the Mediterranean and northwest winds and shipwrecks, etc. But there are details here that God gives to us that we're going to slow down and keep at the same pace moving through our study of the book of Acts. We're just going to work through the first 13 verses of Acts 27. And as we move through the details, I want you indeed to understand the geography and what's happening as far as the voyage. But this morning we're going to look at what it means to trust God in the context of what the Apostle Paul is doing, in the context of what's happening here in this passage. You came in this morning and you remember the verse that was up here on the screen from the book of Isaiah that talks about the man or the woman having perfect peace. Why? Because she trusts in the Lord. And so this morning we're going to look at this theme of trust as we embark on our own journey through Acts 27, 1 through 13, setting sail for Rome. Let's read together our passage. Luke writes, Acts 27, verse 1, when it was decided that we would set sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. We're going to start looking at the beginning of the journey. You have notes, an outline for you in your bulletins. And we see that first we find embarking on the journey in verses 1 through 3. How did this all get started? Luke writes this: when it was decided that we would set sail for Italy. The key word there is we. This is the first time Luke uses this pronoun since chapter 21 and verse 8. He has been out of the picture. He has not been with Paul in the intimacy of what's been going on in the trial portion of Paul's life here. It's likely that he's around, perhaps helping Paul medically here and there. He could be gathering information for his writing of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. So it seems that he's there, but not with Paul personally. And so he reintroduces himself by saying, we would set sail for Italy. They proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So Paul's not the only prisoner on this ship. There are others included with him. And it's not necessarily that all of them had appealed to Caesar in the same way that Paul had. It's also not likely that they were all Roman citizens, because most commonly in this kind of setting, the prisoners that were sent to Rome on a ship were sent to Rome to be killed, and they were not Roman citizens. It's possible that some of the prisoners here were being sent to Rome as entertainment, part of the gladiator shows in the Colosseum where they would be killed for their crimes. In any case, Paul, as a Roman citizen who had appealed to Caesar, he would receive special consideration in contrast to the rest of the common prisoners. Luke tells us that the leader of this journey was a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. We're not sure why this label Augustan is used. Some would translate it as imperial, the battalion or the group of soldiers. This was a special group. And we go on in verse 2, and it says, and embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia. We put out to sea. Let's stop right there. We have our first of 3 maps. These are going to help you just grasp what's being said here. So an Adramyttian ship, this connected it to the city of Mysia on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. You can see it there if you look closely. So this ship, the plan was for it to travel along the coast of Asia. It was likely a smaller vessel that would be heading home from Caesarea for the winter, and it would stop at various places, dropping things and people off, picking things and people up along the way. This would be its last journey before the stormy weather of the winter would set in. Now, the most common route to take from Caesarea to Rome would be through the city of Alexandria and the north of Africa. But it seems there was no larger ship available, so they chose this one. This ship, as we said, would end its journey in Mysia. But Julius was confident that he could find another ship to take Paul and the rest of the prisoners on to the capital of the empire, Rome. At the end of verse 2, we're told about another man who accompanied Paul along with Luke. Luke says, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. Now, you might remember that name. He was a traveling companion on the 3rd missionary journey with the Apostle Paul. He was one of the men that was dragged along by the mob in the city of Ephesus during the riot there. He came home with Paul to Jerusalem on that 3rd missionary journey. He was also present with Paul when he wrote Colossians, the apostle, wrote Colossians and Philemon. Paul calls him a fellow worker in Philemon, verse 24. He calls Aristarchus a fellow prisoner in Colossians 4, verses 10 and 11. You might remember that Paul was in custody in Philippi and Caesarea, and soon he'd be in custody in Rome. It seems that Aristarchus was in custody with him during his time of the Roman imprisonment. So along with others, this man provided the apostle encouragement during these times of incarceration. Tradition tells us that Aristarchus was martyred by Nero in Rome. There's a question we might have. Paul is in prison. He is in custody. He's being taken to the next phase of his trial. Why are Luke and Aristarchus allowed to go with him? I mean, who decides how many people you can take with you on a ship to go to the next stage of your imprisonment? One man believes that they must have gone as Paul's slaves, maybe communicating that to the Romans. And this would give Paul an elevated status during the journey. And we'll see how that status is a blessing for the apostle and his traveling companions. But there's no clear indication that that's the case. Others say, well, perhaps Luke traveled as Paul's doctor. Paul had health issues. We read about those in other parts of the New Testament. Or maybe even Luke signed up as the ship's physician and convinced the people in authority to allow him to go. It could simply be that Aristarchus was a paying passenger. The ship was large, and it could hold a few extra men. So whatever the case, we have there in verses 1 and 2 just the introduction of the voyage, and then Paul and Aristarchus and Luke traveling together. We come now to verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon. So what has happened is 70 miles have passed. They put out from Caesarea, and they put in at Sidon. Sidon, about 70 miles north of Caesarea. You can see it there on the map. It had an excellent harbor, and the purpose here was to trade. And look what Julius does. Luke says Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. He showed Paul consideration. The Greek word is philanthropos. You can hear the English word philanthropy. And in English and in Greek, it's the same meaning. It is a lover of mankind. He was a kind man. He showed kindness to the apostle. He wasn't obligated to do so just because Paul had appealed to Caesar. We don't know his motivation. It could have been because of Paul's position. Whatever the case, this is good providence. Julius shows kindness to him. And you see what it says. Luke says he allowed him to go to his friends in the city of Sidon and receive care. Julius's benevolent attitude played itself out in benevolent action. Interesting, in the New Testament, and we've mentioned this before, centurions are always presented well. And we don't know why. It just seems that they fit into God's story, and they're part of the good guys. And Julius fits the bill there as well. Cornelius, remember back for another example, Acts chapter 10, also a Roman centurion. So Julius extends this kindness. We see kindness extended throughout the voyage. And Luke says that Paul was able to go to his friends and receive care. Again, possibly some medical situation has come up. And Luke is along there with Paul, communicating what's going on and knowing that more medical treatment needs to be given to the apostle. He has been in custody for a long time, remember. This is Paul's first recorded trip to Sidon, but the gospel reached this city much earlier. We read back in Acts chapter 11 and verse 19 that those believers who were scattered because of the persecution of Christians, or persecution of Christians because of the martyrdom of Stephen, those people went to places like Antioch and Cyprus and here, Phoenicia. So these are the apostles' friends. And just to fill out your thinking about what this looks like, remember that handcuffed, in our wording, to the apostle would be a soldier, because Paul was still in custody. And he could move about, but he was still not a free man. God, let's talk about some application here. God is big enough to trust. He's big enough to trust. Look at what's happening here for the apostle. As a reminder, he had been given a vision by Jesus back in Acts 23 and verse 11. And Jesus says, don't fear, I'm going to take you to Rome. And so he was confident he was going to go to Rome, but there were no details about how he would get to Rome. He was in custody at the time, and we mentioned earlier in our study of the book that it was likely he thought, well, maybe I'll be freed during one of these trials and they'll pronounce me innocent and actually let me go, and then I can travel to Rome. But that didn't happen. You see, he was a prisoner and he knew his destination was Rome. But his trust in the Lord would be challenged. The promise of the destination was there, but the means by which he would get there was not clear. And for you and me, it's the same. Now, we haven't been given a vision about going to the capital of the Roman Empire. No, we've been given a grander vision. We've been given the explanation of where we're headed as followers of Jesus. We're headed to heaven. And we are here in this time, in this place, and we know where we're going. We know where the destination is. But if we're honest, that moment when you first came to Christ, where you first realized that you needed to trust Him for the payment of your sin, and you yielded to Him, you submitted to Him, you embraced Him and His ways rather than your own. There was a path that you thought you would take to get yourself to heaven, right? There was a path that you thought God would use to lead you there. You moved through those first few weeks, those first few months, those first few years of being a believer, and you realize this trip is way different than I expected it was going to be. The journey from where we are to heaven is not mapped out for us. We know the destination, but the journey is so different that it requires us to trust God along the way. Paul, in a micro sense, is experiencing the same thing. He knows where he's going. This journey is way different. And believe me, as we move through the rest of Acts 27, it's going to get even more difficult for him. As we're moving through our journey in life, we have opportunity to trust God. And just like the Apostle Paul experiences here in verse 3, God gives, we'll call them good providences, encouragements along the way in the form of people or events, different circumstances around you. And as you're moving through the journey that's more difficult than you thought it would be, and that's true for everybody, nobody has an easier journey than they expected, by the way. It's always more difficult. So as you're moving through your journey, God provides good providences here and there. And they lift you up. They encourage you. They give you strength to continue on the journey the next day, even though it's so different than you thought. And so here Paul is, still a prisoner, and what does God provide? A good providence. A kind, benevolent centurion who says, yes, you can go to this first city that we've stopped and go see your friends. And you know that they encouraged him. They received him. They cared for him. And he was able to move on to the next stage of his journey. So that's embarking on the journey. Look now, secondly, at encountering the difficulties. Difficulties upon difficulties, beginning here in verse 4. Read what it says. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. Now, if you look at the map, you can see the Cyprus is an island right off the coast there of Syria. And the land, as it's described here by Luke, is protecting the ship from the winds. The prevailing winds in the Mediterranean are westerly, meaning they move from the left side of the map to the right side of the map. That's a challenge, right, if you're trying to go to Rome, because Rome is on the other side of the map. And so the trip from the areas of the second and third missionary journeys, those were simple. Coming home that way, the wind was behind you, and you just sailed from Greece to Israel in today's political map. If any of you have ever been to Catalina Island, just off our coast, 20 miles or so. You know that there's a calm side, and then there's a rough side. The side of Catalina Island facing the coast of California is calm. That's where the capital of the island, Avalon, is. That's where the bay is. You can see down in different inlets along that side of the island, some 20 feet to the bottom of the ocean there. Beautiful fish, kelp, wonderful, wonderful place to snorkel. The other side is exposed to all the winds as they blow in offshore. It's a rugged side of the island. Places like Shark's Cove, those kinds of names. If you were to choose, which side of the island do I want to sail, you would choose the calm side, not the rough side. And that's what's happening here. They need to go from Judea to Rome. And they are trying to find the safest passage to get there as the winds are blowing against them. Luke says specifically the winds were contrary. And contrary winds, as we think about the details of what's going on here in Acts 27, these are going to be northwest winds. Winds blowing from the upper left of the map to the lower right of the map. And that's exactly the opposite direction they would like the winds to be blowing. And so they are trying to sail in the direction of the wind. In that day and age, it was not possible to sail directly into the wind. So they are in the shelter of Cyprus. You see there the extended peninsula going to the northeast. That's where they're sailing along. The coast of Cyprus is protecting them from the wind blowing. And then we get to verse 5. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. So they now have moved past the island of Cyprus, and then they're along the coast there of Asia Minor, or Turkey today, and the names of the provinces there, Cilicia and Pamphylia, are listed for you. And understand that the ocean current runs westward along the coast from right to left, and the land would protect them still from the wind coming from the northwest. So they come to the town Myra, a little over 2 miles inland. A large amount of grain trading went on in the harbor area of this city. Look at verse 6. When we had sailed for there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. Julius is looking for an opportunity to change ships. Why? This ship is not going to Rome. He needs to get to Rome. So he's looking, he finds one, and it's described as an Alexandrian ship. Coming from where? Alexandria, North Africa. As we said, there was extensive grain trade going on in the Mediterranean here, and the Roman Empire dominating this area of the world. Egypt was seen as the chief granary of Rome. One person even called it the breadbasket of Rome. In other words, crops grown in Egypt and then taken by ship up to Rome. This ship either stopped here for trading, or it was driven off course because of the wind. You can see the direction from Alexandria up to Rome, and you can see how the winds would blow it this direction. We can gather the size of the ship from verse 37. It says there that all of us in the ship were 276 persons. This was not a small personal craft. Likely, as was common in those days, these ships, this one fit into that description, about 200 feet in length, a little bit less than 50 feet wide. They carried grain and passengers. And so Julius puts the prisoners and the soldiers on board. Now we get to verse 7. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. So they're sailing described as a good many days with difficulty. Cnidus was about 130 miles from Myra at the southwest point of Asia Minor. And if there was no contrary wind, they could have done this journey in about a day. But because the wind is blowing directly against them, it's several days with great difficulty, as Luke describes it. They could have stayed here and waited for a while for more favorable winds, but the rest of the verse seems to indicate that they couldn't stay because it was too dangerous. They couldn't go any further west here. And it looks so simple as we look at the map. We see that it's just across that little part of the ocean. They can just get across there really quickly over to Greece and then up onto the area where Rome would be. This area is described this way by an historian who says a wind that would drive the ship toward Salmone would be a northwesterly wind, normal for late summer. But compared to Cnidus, the south coast of Crete had more harbors, and it would be a better place to try to get to their destination. So they go under the shelter of Crete. You may remember the location of this island being significant because this is where Titus would later serve as pastor. So they're forced by the wind to sail southwest, finding protection on the island as they went around Salmone, that place on the far right, the eastern side of the island. And then we come to verse 8. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Fair Havens, a small bay, opens to the east and southeast. A little bit beyond this place, the coast of Crete curves quickly north, and there would no longer be protection from the wind. At this point, it seems that they decide not to proceed past Fair Havens. They're going to just stay there. They could have found winter quarters there. We'll see what happens as we move on in the account here. But thinking of application, I want you to turn to Job chapter 38. Remember, our application all has to do with trusting God. Job 38 is an excellent reminder that God is the one who controls the weather. And I know it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, that's true, God controls the weather. But look at how this is communicated. This is after Job and his counselors, in quotes, have spoken. God enters into the conversation, and he says this in verse 3 to Job, "Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." Look down at verse 12. "Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place?" You see, God is explaining to Job who he is and what he is able to do, how he controls what's going on in the earth. Look down to verse 19. "Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place? That you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home. You know, for you were born then," he's mocking Job here, "and the number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle? Where is the way that the light is divided, or the east wind scattered on the earth?" Look at verse 25. "Who has cleft a channel for the flood, or a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land without people, on a desert without a man on it, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the seeds of grass to sprout? Has the rain a father? Or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb has come the ice and the frost of heaven? Who has given it birth?" Look at verse 34. "Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, 'Here we are'?" The answer to all those questions is no. Job cannot do anything like that. Why? Well, because God does everything like that. He is the one who controls all the details of the weather. And as the Apostle Paul and Luke and Aristarchus are on this ship, and they're experiencing the headwinds going directly against where they need to go, for them to be able to remember God's in control, not just in a general way, but God's in control of the weather. Again, not just a general way, He's in control of this wind. He's in control of what's going on. He is He's causing this journey to be very difficult. But He's in charge. And listen, if God has enough power to control the weather, He has enough power to take care of you. You can trust Him because of His power. You can trust Him because of His goodness. You can trust Him because anything that He wants to accomplish, He accomplishes. So whatever's going on in life that seems to be going against you, God's powerful enough to take you through that. Now we move to the third segment of the journey for this morning, examining the circumstances there, beginning in verse 9. Why don't we put up the second map now, a little bit of a close-up to what's going on here. Luke writes, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. So the voyage was now dangerous. They are weather-bound. The weather has caused their journey to be much longer than they had hoped. It became clear they would not be able to complete their journey to Rome before the arrival of winter. You know that there are hurricane over on the East Coast, right? Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic Ocean. You read about those, you hear about those. Well, you know that they don't happen throughout the year. There's a season for hurricanes. The broadest part of the season would be June to November, but it's serious hurricane season, August to October. And so it's similar to what's being spoken of here. What they're looking at is the calendar and saying, it's dangerous for us to keep trying to sail to Rome now. It's too late in the season. We can't continue to move forward in our journey. And specifically, they tie it together to a Jewish holiday when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over. Even the fast. This is talking about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It was known simply as the fast because of its importance. It took place, still takes place, around the end of December, beginning of October, and that year, 59 AD, we believe, it took place on October 5th. So ancient sailors, outside of the Jewish context or the spiritual context, they considered navigation on the Mediterranean as dangerous from early October until the middle of March. In fact, reading history, there is zero navigation from November 10th to March 10th. So they're right on the cusp there, and the danger is increasing as they wait. So they had left Caesarea in the summer, likely late August. They had taken only one day to get to Sidon, but then the winds impacted them. And instead of them being able to go to Rome quickly, they had been not blown off course yet, but they had been delayed. So Luke says Paul began to admonish them. What's remarkable about this? Well, Paul's a prisoner, and he's admonishing ship's captains, officers, Roman soldiers. 200 people are on the ship again. You would think he earned some level of respect among the soldiers guarding him. Perhaps he was given voice because of his experience traveling and his experience even with shipwrecks. And perhaps God had gifted him spiritually with leadership abilities, and those were evident. So look what Paul says in verse 10. And he said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." Paul says, I perceive. This is the result of careful observation. He's not saying, I had a vision. God told me. I have an omen to give to you. He's not claiming any type of prophecy. Just remember, he is a wise man and he has experience. Remember what he wrote over in 2 Corinthians 11:25. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and I spent a night and a day floating around in the ocean. He had some understanding of what was going on in the Mediterranean Sea. And so he says, I think where we're going here, there's going to be great loss. Cargo, ship, lives, damage is going to be done. His advice seems to be, we should stay here, or we should find a better harbor near here that we could just remain here for the entire winter. That's wisdom speaking, and he believes that wisdom would be to stop the journey. Now, I want to speak about the Roman mindset before we get to verse 11. Pagans who were involved in sea voyages in that day sacrificed to the gods and sought their protection. They wanted safe journeys. So they would look at events like bad omens or astrological interpretations or dreams as something that would prevent them from sailing if they took those seriously. They likely listened to what Paul said and knew who he was. And you know that he and Luke and Aristarchus are talking about Christ to everybody. They likely took what he said and put it in that category of some kind of spiritual omen thing. And so they wait it out, and they decide that this is not the direction they want to go. Verse 11 now. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. The centurion makes the decision, and we wonder, well, why is he making the decision? Shouldn't the captain make the decision? And the answer is no. In this day, the centurion had a higher rank than the ship's officers. Why? Because the grain ship was considered to be in government service. The ship was owned by the Roman government, and they hired people to captain the ships. But the centurion, he was a Roman civil servant. And so once he came on board, he was the one who made the decisions. These ships were devoted to the grain trade, as we said. The centurion was responsible for the soldiers, he's responsible for the prisoners, and he's responsible for the cargo. The pilot and the captain, what are they motivated by? Likely economics. They just want to get to Rome as quickly as possible so they can be paid as quickly as possible. So the centurion decides with the nautical experts over and against spiritual wisdom. Look at verse 12. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Let's go to the third map. Now, this is just a modern-day map of Crete with a pin put in the place where we believe Fair Havens was. We don't know exactly where Fair Havens was. We don't know exactly where Phoenix was. But the decision is that Fair Havens is not a good place to spend the winter. The majority, as Julius convenes a meeting, they gather around, they decide that we need to just move on and try to get to this place called Phoenix. That's where the vote takes them. Have you ever been in a situation where you understand that you have some wisdom, you have some faith, you're following the Lord as best as you can, you have experience to add to a situation, and you communicate that, and everybody else votes against you? That's what's happening here to the Apostle Paul. And we're encouraged here to trust God even when everyone around you disregards God. Now again, we're not saying God told Paul anything at this point. What we are saying, God had led Paul through several experiences of life, and he had wisdom to give, and they all reject it. Different motives. They say, we don't want to listen to you. What Paul experiences here is what sometimes you and I experience, that we need to trust God more than we trust our plans. And you can think, well, what is the apostle thinking now? These people are foolish. We're going to end up in a bad situation. But it's not time to not trust God. It's a time to trust him even more. And so with that, we come to fourth and finally, experiencing the calm. Verse 13, when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. So on the map, they move out of Fair Havens. They go around that southernmost point of the island of Crete, and they begin to try to find the harbor known as Phoenix, there along that portion of the island. We believe it's only about a 40-mile trip. Could have been done in less than a day. It seems promising, like this was a good idea. In fact, Luke writes, they supposed that they had attained their purpose. Why? Well, because there was a wind at their backs, and everything is going well. And they're thinking, well, now we can relax. We can enjoy this part of the trip. It'll take just a few hours to get to where we want to go. They're thinking we made the best decision in the world. And you wonder what Paul's thinking. Maybe he's wrestling with, well, maybe. But every step that you take away from wisdom, even when everything seems fine around you, leads you toward deeper danger. You see, we're called to trust God, and he needs to be trusted more than visible circumstances. And so, what a contrast as we see what this verse says and what has come before it. And as we get ready for next week, which, by the way, there's a shipwreck, we see here in this verse all the visible signs of everything going well. We have a negative example of trusting God here, that these men trusted the outward calm more than they trusted God. We can really say that verse 13 is the calm before the storm, because it really is the calm before the storm. Beware of people who say, or beware of yourself saying, I know this is right because of all the peace in my life. Everything around me is just going so well, I know the decision I made was right. And sometimes you scratch your head because they're saying, I feel such peace at this sin I just committed. And they wouldn't call it that, but when you hear about their decision process or what they actually decided to do, you know that, well, that can't be right. But the peace comes. Sometimes it even starts to impact you, and you feel pretty good about things. That's a dangerous place to be. Did Jesus experience any peace in the Garden of Gethsemane? At first, it was all unpeaceful. What did he do? He didn't say, well, I'm going to stop doing this because I'm not at peace. No, he plowed through it. He plowed through it. God, what do you want me to do? And the answer was, I want you to do the hardest thing imaginable. And that's the answer that sometimes we have. So we are very careful with this idea of peace. God-wrought peace is not the same as circumstances-wrought peace. In fact, sometimes, as we see here in verse 13, they're different. So as we see the Apostle Paul and Luke and Aristarchus embark on this first part of the journey, we're reminded several times to trust God, to know that as we navigate through our Christian lives, the only way God is going to grow us is by sending storms into our lives. That's how we're going to trust him more. And so we're not surprised. We move forward. Our trust increases. Our strength increases. And God receives all the glory. Let's pray together.